Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Function in 19 years in Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. After the deaths from cocaine poisoning of two nationally known athletes in 1986, drug testing became a major issue. Advocates believe that testing people for drug use in government, industry, and schools would discourage drug abuse. Critics argued that forcing persons not suspected of any crime to undergo drug testing was a violation of their constitutional rights. Still others argued that the drug tests themselves were unreliable. In fact, drug testing is not a new idea. In Washington, D.C., for example, persons arrested and sent to jail had been routinely tested for drugs since the early 1970s. And since these persons had already been charged with a crime, requiring them to submit to a drug test did not seem to violate any essential rights. But except for research, not much use was made of these tests, at least until recently. Beginning in 1984, the results of these tests were given to judges to help them decide who should be released while awaiting trial.
Black up number 3. Could you step to the bar, please? May I see your armband? Good morning. My name is Glenn White. I'm with DC Pretrial Services Agency. We're collecting urine samples for drug tests. The results will be used to help set your release conditions. Are you able to submit a urine sample now?
That's right.
Starting at 7 a.m. every morning in the District of Columbia Jail, between 70 and 140 new arrestees give urine specimens to be tested for a variety of drugs.
All right, I need you to check the name on this label. If it's correct, place it on the side of the cup.
"20% more arrestees tested positive for drugs in 1986 than in 1984 when the program started. The biggest increase is the use of cocaine, which has almost tripled. Jay Carver directs the program.
And we know that the drug use is a factor which correlates very strongly to the two factors which judges must consider when setting release, namely failure to appear and rearrest. Prior research has shown that drug users are much more likely than non-users both to miss court appearances and to be rearrested while on pretrial release.
Pre-trial rearrest rates in the District of Columbia are 50% higher for drug users than non-users, and higher still for multiple users. The Chief Judge of the District of Columbia Superior Court, Fred Ugast.
I believe there is almost unanimous support, if not unanimous support, for the utilization of drug testing of all individuals at the time of arrest before they're brought into court for their initial hearing, as long as the individual rights of the individual are safeguarded, and that is done by reason of the fact that no information obtained through the drug tests may be used in any way in connection with any guilt phase of any criminal proceeding.
The DC program uses the EMIT test system and checks each arrestee for 5 drugs: opiates, PCP, methadone, cocaine, and amphetamines. 65 tests can be run each hour. About 3,600 are done each month.
It gives us quick results. We have our testing lab set up right in the courthouse, and basically we can get the results within an hour. And we know that if the information is going to be useful, it has to be available immediately.
Although the accuracy of the EMIT test is disputed, the manufacturer claims 97% of the analyses are correct, and the pretrial services technicians perform constant maintenance and calibration checks. Each positive test is immediately rechecked before the results go to the judge. John Clark heads the lab.
These samples right here were collected in the cell block this morning of defendants who were arrested last night. The results of these tests have to be ready for court within about an hour or so. Right now, what the tester is doing is placing the samples, pouring the samples into sample cups and placing them on the respective places on the tray. Once the tray is ready, the operator will place it on the auto carousel here and press the run button. From that point, the entire system is automated.
Chemicals react with each specimen, and the mix is run through a beam of light that determines the presence or absence of the individual drug. The results are recorded and put in the computerized records of the arrestee.
Can I help you?
Yeah, I couldn't take my urine.
As a condition of release, judges may also order defendants to participate in the testing program for weekly drug checks.
Okay, and I'll get someone to escort you there.
More than 2,000 defendants report each month for these weekly checks, as simulated here. Offenders who test drug-free during this period are no more likely to be rearrested than non-drug users. Because this testing is available to monitor drug use, judges are now releasing more offenders in the pretrial period.
PCP?
Yes, sir.
No, that's wrong. That's wrong. I know what it was. I was on this medicine I got from the store.
Well, sir, there's no medicine that will test you positive for PCP. Remember that you have to come in here drug-free because that was part of your release conditions.
If the defendant tests positive, the judge can revoke release or impose more stringent conditions.
The judge may set tougher conditions of release or may require the individual to go into some kind of a structured program, possibly work release, in order to, until at least the judge or the judicial officer is satisfied that this individual is going to be able to remain in the community and free of drugs.
With me now to discuss these matters are Jay Carver, Director of the District of Columbia Pretrial Services Agency, Elizabeth Simons, attorney with the National Capital Area Affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Dr. Eric Wish, a drug researcher. Mr. Carver, what proportion of the people entering the D.C. jail have been using drugs at the time of their arrest?
Well, of those coming into the court system, 2 out of every 3 are consistently testing positive for at least one of the drugs that we test for, and most, that is a majority, are testing positive for more than one drug.
What are the most commonly abused drugs that the test revealed?
That varies from month to month. PCP use has been very high since we began our testing program almost 3 years ago. Cocaine use has been on the upswing. It is currently found in about 46 to 48% of all arrestees. Opiate use is also a significant problem.
Opiate use would include heroin.
Exactly. And that averages around 18 to 20% of arrestees coming into the system.
Are there any important differences among the arrestees along lines of sex or age or the kind of crime in terms of drug use?
Well, we've found that the younger age categories are more predominantly involved with PCP use, and that seems to tail off somewhat as they get older. Opiate use, heroin use, is seen more frequently among the somewhat older age groups. By older, I'm speaking of 26 to 35 age groups. Generally, we've found that women, statistically speaking, have a much higher incidence of drug use than do the men coming through the system.
Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I'm not really sure why that would be.
On a national average, women tend to be arrested for crimes much less frequently than men. But of those who are arrested for crimes, the rate of drug use seems to be higher for women. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct.
I see. Now, tell us exactly what happens when a person comes into the system. They're arrested, they're taken to jail, they're booked, and the first test is consequent on the immediate booking. Is everyone tested when they come in?
Everyone who comes into the criminal justice system is tested.
And that information is then given to the judge at the time the judge is deciding whether to release him while awaiting trial.
That's right. We conduct the tests in the courthouse itself, The testing process is quite efficient in that we are able to produce reports, test results within a very short period of time, and by the time the defendant is in court for his first appearance, his arraignment appearance, the judge does have those test results available for use in setting conditions of release.
Now, how does the judge use this information? Is this the most important thing the judge uses to determine release, or is it just one of many factors?
Well, it's not so much used to determine release or not release as it is to set conditions of release for those that the court intends to release anyway. And essentially, any defendant who has an indication of drug abuse will be released with a condition that the defendant either report for a treatment program or perhaps to come back to the Pretrial Services Agency on a periodic basis for testing to determine if he is refraining from illegal drug usage.
And that testing is usually on a weekly basis?
It begins on a weekly basis. We have a procedure whereby if defendants continue to test positive for drugs, the frequency of the testing is intensified, and then they're required to come in on a twice-weekly basis.
What if they flunk the test? What if they come in with dirty urine in one of these weekly checks?
Well, initially they are admonished against further drug usage. It is explained to them that if they continue to use drugs, that information will be reported to the court, and the court may well wish to take further action. We have in place a system of what you might call internal sanctions, whereby defendants can be required to come in more frequently if they continue to test positive for drugs. And if they continue to test positive, even after these internal or administrative sanctions, then we do pass on this information to the court, and judges will usually schedule some sort of a hearing to look further into the matter.
How confident are you that these tests are reliable?
I'm confident that the tests are reliable. We participate in a proficiency testing program whereby samples are sent to us periodically for testing, and we send the results back to the firm that provides this service. Since we have begun our testing program, we have consistently scored 100% accuracy in this proficiency testing program.
Let me turn to Dr. Eric Wish here for a moment and look at this problem more broadly. Some people think that drug use causes crime, and that what we see coming into the D.C. jail are people who started on drugs and then turned to crime. Is that your view?
Well, I think it's a little more complex than that. I think that there are no doubt some people who are abiding by the law and fell off the track, so to speak, and got involved with hard drugs, developed some type of habit, needed money to supply their drugs, and committed crimes. On the other hand, we now know that there are also a lot of people who had a lot of problems before they even got involved with drugs, who had arrests before they got involved in drugs. And for them, it appears that the drug use and heavy drug use actually is an accelerator. It is an indicator of more increased criminal activity, and perhaps with many of them, a commitment to deviance, a commitment to a life of crime. Many of these people have very limited education, very limited job skills, and very limited prior job history.
You're saying that the fact that they're on drugs may increase the number of crimes that they commit, that they might commit more while on drugs than off drugs?
Absolutely. There's been some excellent research done in a variety of cities, and basically it all comes out to the same type of conclusion, and that is the more heavily that an offender is using drugs during his or her life, the more crimes that they're committing. And in fact, there has been some good research showing that when people are either made through treatment or on their own to reduce the level of heavy drug use, their crimes also reduce. And I want to make it clear that we're not just talking about people who are committing a lot more drug crimes, that is, sale or possession of drugs. We're finding that the people who are the multiple drug users have all their crimes increased.
Including violent crimes?
Yes.
I see. Now, you said that reducing drug use may reduce the rate at which some people commit crimes. Do you think mandatory drug testing would lead some or all of these people to reduce their drug use and thereby to reduce the number of their crimes?
Well, there's some good evidence from a study in California that when persons were put into treatment that started off as an inpatient program and then out in the community where there was continued urine surveillance, that there were marked reductions in drug use and crime.
Now, what role does testing play in this? Suppose a person is found guilty of a crime. Could the judge, in your view, reasonably order drug testing as a condition of some sentence?
Absolutely. We have completed recently a study of
probationers and probation officers in New York City, and we found that even in the most intensive supervision probation program in the state of New York, that probation officers were unable to accurately predict who was using drugs among their current caseload. In fact, although the probationers, 23% of the probationers told us that they had used drug recently, it turned in about an equal percentage of them were thought by the probation officers to have used drugs recently, that 68% were positive by the urine test. So the point is that if we want probation officers to be able to monitor their probationers in terms of illicit drug use, the only cost-effective and reasonable way to be able to do that at the moment is through some type of drug testing.
And when you say cost-effective, are you implying that in your judgment these tests are reliable and are reasonably inexpensive?
Well, there's a big controversy on the reliability of the tests, and no test in the medical field or in the psychological field, just about any field, is 100% accurate. There definitely are errors that occur in drug tests. That is, sometimes a test will find a drug when the person really didn't take one, and in other instances the test will not find the drug when the person took it.
Well, take the first case when the test finds a drug when the person didn't use it. What is your fallback position? Do you repeat the test?
The best way is to repeat the test with another method that does not rely on the same type of chemical reaction that the original test did.
I see. And do you think if these tests are systematically employed that not only will probation officers have better information, but that drug users will in fact reduce their use of drugs?
I think that will happen.
Do you have any evidence yet that that has happened?
Within that study in California that I referred to earlier, where there was marked reduction in drug use and crime. And also I think the military is a good example whereby having random testing in the military, there was a marked reduction. It appears like there was a considerable deterrent effect there.
Let me turn to Elizabeth Simons and ask her, what civil liberties issues do you see in the drug testing? First, let's begin with pretrial detention. What is the issue there?
There are a number of fundamental issues. First, I think it's important to remember that we're talking about people who are innocent until proven guilty, and that what the government's doing is making them take very intrusive tests before they've even been proven guilty. Another fundamental constitutional issue here is the fact that when a judge is looking at conditions of pretrial release, what he or she should keep in mind is, will the person show up for trial? And we haven't been convinced of the relevancy of the drug testing data. What we think would be important for a judge to look at is, does the person have ties to the community? Does he or she have family or a job? And what the judges are doing in the district, they're looking at these drug tests, and it looks so scientific. You could see from the monitor. Didn't that look phenomenally scientific with all of those needles and machines? And it's so much easier for district judges to take what looks like objective data and make a decision, rather than looking at what should be viewed to see if a person can constitutionally be denied pretrial release. There's a question also here of the accuracy of the tests, and Eric was saying there's a lot of controversy on it. Many experts have said that this EMIT test that's used in the district has to be confirmed by an alternative method, which is just what you suggested. It's not just the ACLU that says that. It's many judges across the country who've looked at this in terms of convicted offenders' rights. Many of them have ruled an EMIT test has to be confirmed.
Now, let me go back to the first point you made, that the judges perhaps over-rely on a drug test because of its appearance of scientific accuracy. Suppose the data were available that suggested very strongly that a consistent pattern of drug abuse did affect the likelihood of somebody appearing for trial. Would that evidence persuade you that a drug test could be an appropriate part of the pretrial release decision?
I'm afraid that we're so far from really getting that kind of confirmed evidence that's really just a hypothetical. But because many judges are starting to believe in these tests, decisions are being made now that are affecting people's liberty based on a lot of hypotheticals. It's also a problem when people come back with a dirty test and are going to be held in contempt. They may be put back into the D.C. jail because of a dirty test that may be a false positive. Another problem I see here is that we're spending thousands of dollars on these tests, and if they're properly confirmed, it'll be even more expensive. Why should the federal government be spending $1.8 million to replicate the D.C. system in 10 other cities When in the District of Columbia, you have to wait 4 to 5 weeks to get into a residential treatment setting for drug abuse. Perhaps that's where we should be spending our dollars, not testing people who are innocent before.
Let me look ahead now in the system to a person who has been found guilty or who has pled guilty, and the judge, let us say, puts that person on probation. Now here we have guilt established. Would it be appropriate in your view for the judge to require, as a condition of probation, that the person submit to weekly drug tests?
Not the way the tests are run in the District of Columbia, because there's no alternative confirmatory method. Again, the cases I was talking about were cases brought by convicted offenders who were in prison and who were disciplined on the basis of a single unconfirmed EMIT test. I don't think probationers, any more than convicted offenders, should lose their liberty or their good time credits because of an unconfirmed EMIT. And the fact that DC uses a stationary rather than a portable EMIT system just doesn't wash. I was talking to a toxicologist this morning who said that there was no scientific basis that that EMIT is any more verifiable. It must be confirmed by another method, and many scientific journals and studies have shown a high false positive rate.
Let me turn to Jay Carver and ask him to respond to these criticisms. First of all, the weight of the evidence that supports the proposition that you advance that persons who are drug users are less likely to appear for trial.
That's correct. And I might add that they're also much more likely to be rearrested. And contrary to what Ms. Simon said, judges must consider not only the risk that a person will miss a court appearance, but must also consider the likelihood of rearrest while on pretrial release. And in that area, I think the research is substantial that drug use correlates very strongly with rearrest while on pretrial release.
Well, let me see if I can get you and Ms. Simons to agree on what you would regard mutually as acceptable evidence of a correlation. We'll never have a perfect predictor. Is there any level of evidence that you both would find comfortable as sufficient to warrant drug testing for pretrial arrestees, or do you find that the objection really is on principle?
Well, again, there's still the objection that we have that this is too intrusive. You saw the gentleman follow the detainee into the bathroom. These are observed tests, and there's an intrusiveness level here. There's a privacy aspect that we find very, very troubling, especially, again, when it's done on all of pretrial arrestees, when it's done on children in the District of Columbia. I think that the fact that this is an intrusive test, which a lot of employees have complained to us about, as well as arrestees, makes it troubling on those terms as well.
Do you find this is an invasion of privacy?
I'll grant that there is some intrusiveness in the whole program, but I think you have to look at the governmental interest involved and weigh the nature of the governmental interest, the court's interest, versus the privacy concerns of the individual. And when you see such a strong correlation between drug use and subsequent crime, and when you see that through periodic testing you can actually reduce the incidence of both crime as measured by rearrest, I think it's a very strong argument for using this as a condition of release. And after all, we're not talking about using this to decide whether someone will be released or not, but as a condition of release once they're out.
Eric, where do you come down on this? He has suggested a balancing test. Do you think this is the right way to approach it?
Well, I do think that a lot of the debate is in terms of the cost of testing, the cost of privacy, and there is another side to it. The other side, I think, that needs to be considered is what is the cost of not testing? And I think for that, we have some pretty good evidence that what we have is revolving door justice. We have people that we've studied, for instance, in New York City. They're arrested. We've tested them. We'll find that 80% of them, for instance, are positive for one or more drugs. Then in one study, we actually talked with them again after they had been released from jail about 2 weeks later, and again 80% were positive again. And again, people told us that they were actually, if they had gone back to drugs, the majority had gone back to drugs within 6 hours of release. So what we have now is a system that arrests people who really are committing a lot of crimes, partially because of their drug problem, and we ignore the problem.
What is your response?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to make a distinction between a rearrest rate and somebody going out and committing another crime. Because someone's been rearrested doesn't mean that he or she has actually committed a criminal act. Perhaps he was just on the wrong street corner at the wrong time, looking like someone a police officer didn't like. I think that looking at rearrest rates is very, very troubling. I also, again, have problems with some of the data and the research that's been used correlating drug use and criminal activity, because first of all, when they've been as a result of drug tests, often these are still unconfirmed EMIT tests, so the data really isn't valid. And when it's been on the basis of self-reports, that's also troubling as well, because many arrestees are not going to give you truthful self-reports.
You mentioned that these tests are intrusive. Are they any more intrusive than being, let us say, searched when you enter the jail?
I think they're phenomenally intrusive. I think, especially when we're talking about children having to undergo this, it's very, very troubling. What kind of an example are we going to set for our children?
Are children the object of these tests in your program?
Yes, they are.
And how young do you have to be before you drop out of that testing experience?
Any child charged with an offense and brought to the juvenile division of the court is now tested.
I see.
Ms. Simons mentions intrusiveness. I think you have to keep in mind that this is being used as a condition of release. Traditionally, judges have conditioned defendants' release on paying a money bond, and if they don't happen to have money in their pocket, they end up in jail. I would submit that a condition of release which actually releases more individuals than the system that it replaces is far less intrusive for those people that are now on the street.
Do you think this results in more releases?
No, I don't. And again, a part of the problem is with the accuracy of the test, and I wanted to end with one story in which, and this is a true story, there was a convention of toxicologists, experts on drug testing, and someone said, how many of you would welcome being drug tested if it meant that a positive result would mean you'd have to lose your job, as many employees in the States have to undergo? Not one toxicologist raised his or her hand. They all know that there can be lots of false positive results.
Eric, how broadly is testing for drugs of the sort that we've heard about in the District of Columbia Jail being used now? Is it being accepted widely, or is it being resisted?
I think that there's probably the majority are now looking into it and giving it careful consideration. There is a very strongly vocal minority on this who are attacking the drug testing. I think that most of the debate has been centered around the pretrial time period for testing, and in fact, there are many other periods when the person is found guilty when it may be actually easier to implement some type of testing.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching. For Crime File, I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.